Hello everybody and welcome to this week's update video. My name is Martin. I'm an Inkscape developer developing features and fixes for everyday Inkscape users. And this week I have a tale of lots of ways in which the PDF file format is terrible. And some of the ways that I've managed to make it be less terrible when you open these files in Inkscape. But before we get into the details, I want to give a big shout out and a big thank you to all of my sponsors. Really, truly, it is you guys who are able to help me spend time on Inkscape. Without your help, either through Patreon, LibrePay, I wouldn't be able to basically spend as much time on Inkscape as I do. So thank you all so much. Okay, so what do I mean about PDF? To set the context for this story, Jonathan, who I did an interview with, highlighted a whole bunch of bugs historically in Inkscape that had been broken because the PDF format itself is quite large, and he thought that maybe my work on the PDF importer had sort of fixed some of these issues, and so he went through very diligently checking each of the historical issues to see whether my code had fixed any of them. And for some of them, it definitely had fixed them. But for some of them, it had actually made things worse. And so we had a set of regressions in the PDF importer, and he had them in this list. And he told me about them, and I was just like, oh, I didn't even know about that list. Can you make sure that I know about them by milestoning them for 1.3 so that we can at least fix the regressions, right? So what he did was he went back to all of the historical bugs and set them all for 1.3. That means they have to be fixed for 1.3. But he didn't milestone the regression for 1.3. He milestoned the actual original problem for 1.3. Sure, I could have just ignored that and just assumed what he'd meant. But I took it as a mission to actually fix some of these historical PDF issues. And I'm pleased to say that I think I've pretty much done it. I figured out exactly what was going on for each of them and managed to not only fix the regression, which was usually a crash, some aspect of the code that wasn't quite right, but I also managed to figure out why the historical problem existed and how we could fix it. Okay, so let's go into some examples. The regression is that transparency masks were being applied to both stroke and fill if they were only applied to the fill. So this is because in PDF land, there's no such thing as transparency in gradients. Yeah, I know, it sounds mad, but you cannot set an opacity in a gradient in PDF land. What you have to do is you have to apply a transparency mask as a separate operation on top of it. And Inkscape has to pull this apart. And unfortunately, as my new code is basically pulling it apart, it applied that mask to both the fill and also to the stroke. And this was incorrect. So I fixed that. But I figured, you know what I really, really want to do is I want to be able to figure out why I can't apply or decode this information. And instead of applying it as a mask inside of Inkscape, apply it as actual transparency. And that's what I managed to do. It's actually a thing I wanted to be able to do back in January, I think. But I managed to complete it this time around so that when you open a PDF file that has transparent gradients in it, it will make a best effort to apply the mask to the gradient instead of applying the mask to the object. So it's editable. Because that's the whole point, really, is to not just make it look like the PDF, it's also to make it as editable as is possible. There was a crash in the glyph table, but the actual issue that it was attached to was all about font styles. This was because in my code, it kind of made some assumptions about font families being consistent. And you know how now you can render some of the font families as paths and some of them as text. It didn't recognize the fact that this mode could change halfway through drawing the text. You could end up essentially having to force one of those modes or the other. And in this particular case, it fell back and did an even worse job than it should have done, really. So I had to go back and redo a lot of that font work just to make sure that it was handling font drawing correctly. A lot of this is to do with the way that PDF fonts are applied to text, like introspectively, like it's just, oh yeah, we're drawing some characters now, and now we're setting the font, and now we're drawing some characters, now we're setting the font, and now we're drawing some characters. So it's a whole stream that you have to keep a state of. So another crash that happened because of the way I was using the optional content dictionary. Not all PDFs have optional content, and my code assumed that they did. But I also managed to be able to fix a lot of positional bugs. We were making the assumption that all PDFs have the same page positioning, i.e. that you would essentially be that your page contents would always land on the page itself when drawn. And for the vast majority of PDF files, that is exactly true. But there are enough PDF files that have positional details in the actual page definition itself that had to be handled. I consider those all regressions, because if the contents of the page isn't landing on the page, then you've got a problem. There was a bug in spot colors. The way this was reported was, that the crash was the regression, but the reason why the original bug existed was because Inkscape couldn't handle spot colors in PDFs properly. It could handle them sometimes, but not other times. And the reason for this was because inside of PDF files, there are like other PDF files nestled inside them. And these Form 1 groups, as they're called, are a hierarchical list. And what was happening is that spot colors are each a sort of color profile, and they all have their own unique names, except when you're in one of these Form 1 groups, and they reuse a lot of the same names. And our cache, our color coding cache, was just using the name and going, oh, their names must be unique throughout the entire PDF file. But this is not true. And so fixing that meant that, and that actually took a lot to debug to figure out what was going on, should allow us for better spot color control and spot color support. Not to say that spot colors are imported correctly yet. SVG doesn't have a way of handling spot colors yet, but I'm certainly thinking about how we might be able to do it in the future. I noticed that there was missing area label support. This is where in SVG files you can label text as being a piece of text even if you drew it as a path. Mostly this is so that we can retain some more of the data from the PDF file even if you don't have the font available, but you still want to be able to draw it out as accurately as possible. This helps with not internationalization. What's the other one? Accessibility. That's the one. This helps with accessibility because if you publish that SVG file as an SVG file, you would theoretically, a screen reader would be able to actually see the original text. There was a problem in the way that gradients were applied to text. This actually was because of text is a very specially handled item in PDF land. And what we were doing is we were creating the styles and then applying them later. So we're basically saying, oh, this text has a gradient on it. Cool, let's build a gradient, and then we'll just apply that later. But if you do that, you don't know where the text is going to be positioned on the screen, and therefore you can't disapply the text's position from the gradient so that it actually is positioned correctly over the text. And so if you had a gradient on text, it was broken. The reason why I had to fix that issue was because my gradient code actually failed entirely and there was no fill at all. But I fixed both the regression and also the original bug. So now gradients on text, no problem. Now, next one is a bit weird because in PDF files, a lot of the manipulation of objects is done through clipping. Right? Clipping is where you basically take a shape and you use it as a cutout for something else. So in the example file, all of the text was not really text. It was clipped images. So it was basically a brownish pixel map, and the text was a clipping region applied to that. And for the longest time, I don't think we've ever supported text as clipping in PDF import. The original bug was just that some of the clipping regions for the page were too aggressive and they weren't applying correctly. I fixed the regression, but then I went in and I fixed the actual allowing text to be a clipping region with all of the correct transforms and everything that allows it to apply correctly. That should allow us to support a lot more PDF files. Yeah, so there was also a bunch of state management issues going on with Form 1. I managed to solve all of these. Sometimes it would result in a crash because of just assumptions about how groups were created. No further bug. That was the actual issue on that one, but happy to get it fixed. Altogether, all of these issues have been compiled into a giant merge request that Jonathan is now responsible for testing. Sorry, Jonathan, but thank you for the excellent bug reports and the help compiling this list of issues with PDF. I think with this merged, 1.3 will actually have one of the best PDF import supports I think we've ever had. But let's find out what users think. Some other small non-PDF related issues now. Some small cleanups in the shape builder tool. Some UI fixes for the LPEs to do with bold in the tooltips. I've prioritized text in the paste. This is because one of my patrons, David, said to me that it's very tricky pasting into the text tool, because if the tool that you're using is a Microsoft tool or LibreOffice or Google Docs, it'll try and paste either an image or it'll paste a HTML instead of converting it to text first. What I've done is I've said to it that if you're in the text tool, then prioritize pasting text first. And then if there's no text available, then do the image or some other thing. That should make it easier to paste from things like spreadsheets as well. I also fixed a whole bunch of issues with snapping to pages and bleeds and margins. There was a whole bunch of issues there. And also an export bug where items that were between the page border and the bleed were being stripped away. So it makes the bleed less effective if objects are not included just because they happen to be inside the bleed, but not inside the actual page border itself. That has been fixed. Big thanks to Maren for reporting those issues to me. Okay, so that's all of the stuff that I've managed to get up to, and I think this is probably going to be one of the longest videos in a while. Sorry about that, everybody. In other Inkscape news, PBS has fixed a whole bunch of memory leaks. Always great to see. Mykov has added a preference for the preserve shapes option that he added in. He was getting some pushback between competing use cases about when you want it to apply preserving shapes when the original objects are straight lines. He also added hiding the bleed and margin lines when you do the quick preview key. You can actually hold a key and it shows you basically how the image would look without guides and things. Killer 17 fixed an inverted y-axis bug when editing margins. Maren fixed mouse cursors in the page tool. A lot of love for the page tool this week. And Jeremy Staszewski, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, Jeremy, he fixed an error in the XML parsing. So that's about it for this week. Thank you all for watching these videos, and hopefully you stick around, and I'll see you all next week. Excellent. Then I will see you all next week.